preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Laura Kaminsky, Associate Director of Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Y for the first lecture of 1987 and the opening night of our series presented in cooperation with the new Criterion, Episodes in Criticism on Art, Literature, and Music. There has been one change in the series as was originally listed in our promotional materials. Next week, Professor William Pritchard from Amherst College will speak on Randall Jarrell and the criticism of modern poetry. He will be replacing Professor Cleonth Brooks. The series concludes on January 20th with a lecture by music critic Samuel Lipman, who is also publisher of the new Criterion. The lecture is entitled Music at the Turn of the Century, James Huneker and America's Coming of Age. The house rules ask that no photographs are taken and no tape recording done during the course of the evening, and we thank you for your cooperation. Let's turn now to the evening before us. The format for tonight and for the next 2 weeks is as follows. After the initial lecture, our moderator, Mr. John Gross, will conduct a conversation with the guest lecturer, in which they will pursue further some of the issues raised in the initial talk, as well as others which are deemed of interest. The final section of the evening provides you the opportunity to submit your questions written on the index cards you received upon entering the hall. Later in the evening, the ushers will come down the hall, collect your cards, and bring them backstage for presentation. Our moderator for the series is John Gross, book critic for the New York Times since 1983. Born in London in 1935, Mr. Gross was educated at Wadham College, Oxford, was a Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, and has taught at the University of London and in the United States at Rutgers, Columbia, and Princeton. The author of The Rise and Fall of the Man of Letters, Mr. Gross was the editor of the London Times Literary Supplement from 1973 to 1981, has held editorial appointments on Encounter and The New Statesman, and is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, Commentary, The Observer, and other leading publications in Britain and America. We are honored that he is here with us for the 3 evenings of this series. Our guest tonight, Hilton Kramer, is a regular visitor to the 92nd Street Y. Just a year ago, he opened another lecture series here, which we presented cooperatively with the new Criterion, Culture and Politics, speaking on modernism and its enemies. Since 1982, Hilton Kramer has held the position of editor of the new Criterion. Prior to this, he served as chief art critic at the New York Times, where he had worked in various guises since 1965. From 1955 to 1961, he was the editor of Arts Magazine. From 1962 to 63, the art critic for The Nation. And from 1964 until he joined the Times, he was art critic and associate editor of The New Leader. Mr. Kramer is the author of The Age of the Avant-Garde and The Revenge of the Philistines, Art and Culture, 1972 to 1984. He is currently at work on Abstract Art, Cultural History, the publication of which we can look forward to at the end of this year. He holds a bachelor's degree from Syracuse University and has done graduate work at Columbia, Harvard, Indiana Universities, and the New School for Social Research. We are delighted that he is back with us again this year at the Y. Please join me now in welcoming our moderator, John Gross, and our special guest this evening, Hilton Kramer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening. I'm going to be speaking tonight on the subject of tradition as it has, as the idea has been used in the work of two critics in particular, two art critics in particular in this century. Of the many changes, of the many changes which have overtaken the life of art in our time, none perhaps is more striking to an observer of my generation than the way in which the concept of tradition has in recent years all but ceased to be a vital critical issue. In the vast quantity of writing which is nowadays devoted to art, especially new or recent art, the concept of tradition is either entirely absent as an aesthetic consideration, or if reference is made to it at all, it tends to be invoked merely to indicate some plausible connection between what is happening now and what happened last week or last year, or for those with slightly longer memories, perhaps 10 years ago. It has become a tag, in other words, to indicate the shortest distance between 2 points on the contemporary art scene. The concept of tradition has thus ceased, for all practical purposes, to be an imperative factor in the discussion of art. The position it long enjoyed in critical discourse as an aesthetic consideration has been vacated. And what has taken its place is not so much an alternative concept as an attempt to bypass the very questions which the concept of tradition once encompassed. This represents, I think, a considerable change in the way we think about art and in the way criticism addresses itself to art. We seem already to be well advanced into a period in which the very idea of tradition is becoming obsolete, except perhaps in what we might call a strictly Ralph Lauren context. It therefore seemed to me that it might be worth casting a backward glance at this idea this evening and examine the ways in which it has been used and indeed abused before we bid it farewell forever and face the consequences of its demise. I shall be speaking for the most part about two 20th century American art critics in whose work, it seems to me, the concept of tradition is especially important and especially illuminating. The first of these critics is a writer you are unlikely to have heard of, namely Royal Cortissoz, who, as the art critic for the New York Herald Tribune and certain other publications in the years before and after the First World War, came to symbolize everything that was most reactionary in the public opposition to the modern movement in this country. The second of these critics is a writer you are very likely to have heard of and be acquainted with, namely Clement Greenberg, who, beginning with his contributions to Partisan Review and The Nation in 1939, emerged as the most important champion of the modern movement in the history of American art criticism. It's admittedly an odd conjunction, Royal Cortissoz and Clement Greenberg. Obviously, they are very different figures who have written from very different perspectives. Cortissoz, the very archetype of the patrician who speaks for established institutions and the cultural status quo, and Greenberg, an ex-Marxist of the Trotskyist persuasion, who becomes an ardent spokesman for abstract art and for what has come to be characterized as the formalist position in art criticism. They would appear to agree on almost nothing having to do with the art of the modern age, or indeed with art generally. And it is true, they do agree on almost nothing. Yet each brings to bear a certain concept of tradition in his writings on art, and I doubt if the work of either is entirely intelligible in isolation from the particular notion of tradition that is to be found in their writings on art. Royal Cortissoz, though a considerable eminence in his day, he died in 1948 at the age of 79, is now, I suppose, except among certain scholars, an all but forgotten figure. If he is remembered by anyone else today, it is mainly because Arthur Dove, one of the early American modernist painters whose work Cortissoz failed to appreciate, made a collage in 1925, which is a caricature of Cortissoz. It's now in the collection of the Whitney Museum in New York, though it's scarcely ever shown there, alas. Entitled The Critic, the work shows us a faceless figure who wears a top hat on his head, roller skates on his feet, a monocle dangling from a black cord around his neck. In his left hand, this comical apparition wields not a pen, but a vacuum cleaner. His body, however, is made of nothing more substantial than bits of newsprint, which are drawn, one supposes, from Cortizzoz's articles in the Herald Tribune, and which make a sly reference to Cubists, papier-collé, which Cortissoz particularly abominated. It is an amusing piece of work and accurately represents a judgment that was fairly widespread in the advanced art world of the 20s. That Arthur Dove selected Cortissoz as his target is itself a testimony, of course, to the critic's preeminent position at the time, and it is indeed as the leading representative of critical reaction in his day that Cortissoz has passed into the folklore of American art history. It has to be said that his position in this regard was not unearned. Cortizzoz's reputation as a Philistine has not been exaggerated. He was the real thing. Writing in 1913, for example, about the Armory Show, the mammoth exhibition of 19th and early 20th century European American art, which gave the New York public its first sort of comprehensive look at the modern movement, Cortissoz gave us the essentials of what the Philistine view of tradition then was. The Armory Show was, of course, the great test for critics of Cortizzoz's generation, and it was a test that he, at any rate, conspicuously failed to meet. Tradition for Cortissoz was found to have terminated in the Impressionism of Claude Monet. What followed Monet in the work of the post-Impressionists, in Cézanne, Van Gogh, and Gauguin, and of course even more in the Fauvism of Matisse, and the Cubism of Picasso, and the abstract painting of Kandinsky, all of which he wrote about, was looked upon as little more and sometimes a lot less than an aberration and an indulgence. The standards Cortissoz applied in these matters were fairly simple ones, and they were pretty much the standards of the sort of Philistine middle class at the time. They were regarded as commonsensical standards, and indeed the book of essays in which Cortizzoz's commentary on the Armory Show was published is called Art and Common Sense. There were, in fact, only two standards. Fidelity to what Cortissoz called the truths of nature was one of them, and a certain idea of technical accomplishment, that is, knowing how to draw, was the other. In respect to both, the artists we regard as modern masters were said to have completely failed. About Cezanne, for example, Cortissoz wrote that, quote, he simply did not know his trade. Incidentally, we know from John Rewald's recent biography of Cezanne that it was a view shared by Madame Cezanne. He simply did not know his trade. And further, that, quote, he was merely a second-rate impressionist who had now and then fair luck in painting a moderately good picture, unquote. To this judgment, Cortissoz added a note which has been sounded, I think you'll agree, many, many times since in the writings of many, many critics who, disapproving of new artistic developments, seek reasons other than aesthetic ones for explaining the success of what they most dislike. Cezanne, Cortissoz wrote, quote, would never have come into fame at all if the dealers had not taken him up and there had not been the usual band of scribes, meaning of course art critics, ready to applaud something new, unquote. Now this, I think we have to agree, is not entirely untrue. Dealers and critics do play a crucial role in promoting the work of artists whose qualities are unfamiliar and even distasteful to us, particularly on first acquaintance. And it would be foolish to deny it, especially since in many cases it is a perfectly honorable thing for dealers and critics to do. In any case, Cortissoz wrote similar things about Van Gogh and Gauguin and about Matisse too. Matisse was said to have, of all things, relinquished all respect for technique, and his pictures were judged to be, quote, false to nature, unquote. So Matisse too failed to meet the two standards, that is, technique and fidelity to nature, which Cortissoz and pretty much the established opinion of his time held to be central. Needless to say, Picasso and Kandinsky fared a good deal worse in this judgment. All were artists who could not be fitted into the critic's concept of tradition. And outside the boundaries of that concept of tradition, there was clearly no way they could be taken seriously. 10 years later, that is 10 years after the Armory Show, in a volume of essays on American artists published in 1923, Cortissoz restated his position in the same unequivocal terms. I mean, he was nothing if not adamant and consistent. Quote, I believe in the art that is faithful to a sane vision of nature and an honest craftsmanship, unquote. And further, quote, I disbelieve in modernism because it seems to me to flout fundamental laws and to repudiate what I take to be the function of art, the creation of beauty. Alas, the creation of beauty, which of course is what we're all after in art, turned out not to be the purely aesthetic matter that it was assumed to be. It rarely is, by the way. Other less benign issues were also involved. In this same book on American artists, Cortissoz gave his readers a glimpse of what some of these other, that is, other than aesthetic issues, were. In a short essay called, hard to believe now, in a short essay called Ellis Island Art, he once again denounced the spread of modernism, but now added a new note of alarm. Quote, there is something in this art situation analogous to what has been so long going on in our racial melting pot. the United States is invaded by aliens, thousands of whom constitute so many perils to the health of the body politic. Modernism is of precisely the same heterogeneous alien origin and is imperiling the Republic of Art in the same way. End of quotation. Again, citing the dire consequences of post-impressionism, Cubism, Fauvism, and other modernist movements, Cortissoz concluded, quote, "These movements have been promoted by types not yet fitted for their first papers in aesthetic naturalization. They are the makers of true Ellis Island art," unquote. Well, in a way it's amusing now to read it, but it couldn't have been amusing at the time. And indeed, even now, until we encounter this chilling note of xenophobia in his writing, Royal Cortissoz may strike us as, if not exactly an innocent, then as some sort of benighted but essentially harmless gentleman amateur, a last gasp, perhaps, of the genteel tradition that dominated our culture before modernism arrived to cut off its supply of oxygen. And it is certainly true in that Cortissoz's notion of tradition was one that very much conformed to the tenets of the genteel tradition, with its yearning for a world that was free of the kind of unruly emotions, exacerbated social conflicts, disruptive artistic innovations, and alien cultural influences that we associate with the modern age. But faced with an essay like Ellis Island Art, with its clearly articulated social doctrine, we are obliged, I think, to see Cortissoz as something more than a patrician dodo harboring illusions about a moribund cultural ideal. And the reason I think we have to take this position seriously, for as it has happened, the social doctrine articulated in Ellis Island Art, with its unlovely mixture of nativist ideology, anti-modernist sentiment, political isolationism, and frankly stated racialism, has proved in most of its fundamental components to be a fairly consistent theme in American criticism from Cortissoz's day to our own. It was given a particularly robust expression in the 1930s in the populist criticism of another writer now mainly forgotten, Thomas Craven, who was the most popular writer on art in his day, and indeed his books sold in huge editions and were distributed even by the Book of the Month Club, if one can imagine an art critic's books being distributed by the Book of the Month Club. But Craven was a real figure at the time. And in championing the regionalist painters of the American Scene School, Craven mounted a similar attack on modernism as an essentially alien, that is, un-American form of art. And we have by no means seen the last of it in our own day. For it seems only last week or last year, or whenever it was, this reading of modernism as posing some sort of threat to our nativist American tradition was revived yet again by another popular writer on art, alas, not yet forgotten, namely Tom Wolfe, in whose book, From Bauhaus to Our House, the whole development of modernist architecture is denounced as an essentially un-American activity. This is not the place, I think, to argue with these theories. They're really hardly worth arguing with in any case. But it is worth noting that in the case of Thomas Craven's defense of a regionalist painter like Thomas Hart Benton, an art that derived from the style of El Greco, admittedly distantly derived, a Greek artist who worked in Spain, turns out to be somehow more American than the art derived from Cézanne. And in the case of Tom Wolfe, architectural styles derived from the Beaux-Arts in Paris and from sundry amalgams of the Gothic and the Romanesque are likewise held to be more American than anything derived from Le Corbusier or Mies van der Rohe. There's something really comical about this, but it is, as we know in our own time from the reception of Tom Wolfe's book, it isn't the comedy that tends to be appreciated. What is finally, I think, imperative to note about this entire farrago of socio-aesthetic theories is that the notion of tradition, which is upheld in them, is in the end a completely bogus one. For the Philistine conception of tradition, as I believe this must be called, is not really a viable conception of tradition at all, but an attempt to arrest or repeal the life of culture itself and restore us, if that is the word, to some never land where time stands still and the dynamism of life as we know it in the modern world will remain permanently screened from our consciousness. It also serves to remind us that the concept of tradition is really meaningless if the tradition in question is incapable of accommodating and indeed giving some meaning to new artistic developments. When we turn to the art criticism of Clement Greenberg, we are a long, long way, of course, from the patrician dream world of Royal Cortissoz. We look out on a world in which everything Cortissoz was able to take for granted has collapsed. There is no question any longer of an attempt to repeal the modern world or to substitute the myths of the genteel tradition for the very real problems which that world confronts us with. On the contrary, we are smack up against the most recalcitrant pressures of modern life, and there is no escaping them. And the most compelling issue before us in that critical world is precisely the question of new creative developments and their possibilities. It has to be said that the climate of Greenberg's criticism is an extremely harsh one. In it, the tasks of art are understood to be arduous and always in danger of being compromised and corrupted. Indeed, the very existence of art as a significant human enterprise is radically endangered. The past does not offer a refuge from the present in this view of tradition, but only a guide to what has been done and cannot be done again in the future. Tradition in this conception is definitely not, as one sometimes suspected it was for Cortissoz, a sort of cultural retirement plan. Art in Greenberg's critical universe is severely constricted in its aesthetic options, and the only options that count are the purely aesthetic ones. We are, in other words, totally enclosed in the tradition of modernism. And from this tradition, there is no exit, except, of course, the kind that leads straight to the dreaded realm of academicism, commercialism, and kitsch. Clement Greenberg has been writing art criticism for nearly 50 years now, and as befits a career that has achieved immense influence as well as an impressive longevity, he has become something of an institution in our cultural life. Having become an institution, he has, like Royal Cortissoz, in this respect at least, been made the subject of a hostile caricature. In his case, it's a drawing by David Levine that appeared in the New York Review of Books a few years ago, depicting Greenberg as a papal eminence, a not-so-sly reference to the infallibility that some of Greenberg's more devoted followers have allegedly attributed to him. More seriously, his institutional status has now been marked by the multi-volume publication of his collected essays and reviews by the University of Chicago Press. 2 volumes have appeared a few weeks ago, and 2 more are to come. As we know, to achieve the status of an institution in our culture is inevitably to become an object of criticism and controversy. And this, too, Greenberg has certainly achieved. Just as his ideas have won him significant acolytes, they have also brought him some fierce opposition. I mean, there are people who really despise him. And it is my impression that this is just as true today as it was in the 40s and 50s, when his articles and reviews were appearing with far greater frequency than is nowadays the case. And this, I think, is a tribute to him, because it means, I think, that by friends and foes alike, Greenberg's ideas and judgments are thought to deal with issues which really matter. If we inquire into the nature of these issues, we find that they all, in one degree or another, owe their importance to the place they occupy in Greenberg's account of the tradition of modernism. For Greenberg, modernism is not primarily or exclusively an aesthetic idea, and still less is it a style of art. It is an overarching historical phenomenon which, whether we like it or not, is seen to have shaped our understanding of what it is possible for art to be and for it not to be in the post-Enlightenment civilization of the West during the last 2 centuries. In this view, modernism is not an option for art in our time, but an ineluctable imperative if there is to be any art worthy of the name. And it is, of course, the ineluctable nature of this imperative which has made Greenberg's view of modernism so profoundly distasteful to his many adversaries, that and also the fact that so much has had to be left out of the art which meets his standard for what a truly modernist and vital art might be. There are several writings in which Greenberg has developed this philosophy of modernism, the most notable being the essay on avant-garde and kitsch, published in 1939, the essay called Towards a Newer Laocoon, published in 1940, and the essay on modernist painting, published in the late 50s. As the latter, the essay on modernist painting, is in certain respects a refinement of some of the principal ideas to be found in the earlier essays, and also from my particular point of view, also has the virtue of being sort of shorn of the kind of Marxist phraseology that sometimes disfigured these earlier essays. It is to the essay on modernist painting that we must turn for the clearest account of the historical phenomenon that this critic believes to be central to the life of art in our time. Greenberg begins his essay by asserting that modernism includes more than just art and literature. By now, he writes, it includes almost the whole of what is truly alive in our culture. It happens also to be very much of an historical novelty. Western civilization is not the first to turn around and question its own foundations, but it is the civilization that has gone furthest in doing so. I identify modernism, Greenberg writes, with the intensification, almost the exacerbation of this self-critical tendency which began in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Because he was the first to criticize the means itself of criticism, I conceive of Kant as the first real modernist. For Greenberg, then, as he writes, quote, the essence of modernism lies in the use of the characteristic methods of a discipline to criticize the discipline itself, not in order to subvert it, but to entrench it more firmly in its area of competence, unquote. It is in this notion of a discipline, such as painting, entrenching itself ever more firmly in its area of competence, and indeed confining itself to its area of competence, that Greenberg's most original contribution to the theory of modernism is to be found. Each art, he writes, had to determine, through the operations peculiar to itself, the effects peculiar and exclusive to itself. Greenberg was under no illusions, it's clear, about the costs involved, especially the cost of narrowness. By doing this, he writes, each art would, to be sure, narrow its area of competence, but at the same time, it would make its possession of this area all the more secure. It is at this point, in this very remarkable essay, that Greenberg spells out exactly what this concentration on its area of competence has meant for modern painting. And this is the key passage. Realistic, illusionist art had dissembled the medium, using art to conceal art. Modernism used art to call attention to art. The limitations that constitute the medium of painting, the flat surface, the shape of the support, the properties of pigment, were treated by the old masters as negative factors that could be acknowledged only implicitly or indirectly. Modernist painting has come to regard these same limitations as positive factors that are to be acknowledged openly. Close quote. And of all the limitations that are seen to constitute the medium of painting, it is one in particular, what Greenberg calls the ineluctable flatness of the support, that is, the flatness of the picture surface, that remains, as he writes, quote, most fundamental to the processes by which pictorial art criticized and defined itself under modernism. Flatness alone was unique and exclusive to that art, close quote. Flatness, the flatness of the picture surface, would thus offer a key to the future development of modernist painting in Greenberg's critical view. Now, readers of Tom Wolfe's other excursion into art criticism, The Painted Word, will recall that it was precisely this notion of flatness in Greenberg's account of modernist painting that he attempted to ridicule and reduce to absurdity, and in general have a great deal of merriment with. But in doing so, Tom Wolfe, I think, only revealed that he had never really thought much about the aesthetics of painting, and really had not perhaps begun to grasp its rudiments. So that when the laughter, there was a lot, of those as ignorant as himself had subsided, the issue as Greenberg defined it remained more or less untouched. Now, Clement Greenberg is best known to us, of course, as the great champion of abstract art. It should therefore be noted that in this discussion of painting's area of competence, nothing has thus far been said about the abandonment of representation in modernist painting. But Greenberg's discussion of this issue, too, is one that has been much debated and is indeed the subject of virtually an entire book this season. But this is the passage in which Greenberg talks about the abandonment of representation. It is not in principle, he writes, that modernist painting in its latest phase has abandoned the representation of recognizable objects. What it has abandoned in principle is the representation of the kind of space that recognizable three-dimensional objects can inhabit. Three-dimensionality is the province of sculpture, and for the sake of its own autonomy, painting has had, above all, to divest itself of everything it might share with sculpture. And it is in the course of this effort to do this that painting has made itself abstract. Now, this might seem a rather specialized, esoteric kind of argument, distinctions between painting and sculpture, and I've even heard it said by reputable people that it doesn't really affect the way artists think about their work. But alas, it is precisely this aspect of Greenberg's argument that has prompted the painter Frank Stella to take issue with the view that abstract painting is somehow tied to an anti-illusionist conception of pictorial space. Stella's position, which has now been set forth in his the Norton lectures he gave at Harvard in this new book called Working Space, is devoted to a systematic refutation of Greenberg's whole conception of modernist painting. Although, oddly enough, Greenberg's name is never mentioned in the book. The whole of Working Space is a kind of shadow boxing with an antagonist off stage. But it is really as a polemical response to Greenberg's idea that Stella's Norton lectures were conceived, and indeed that his own recent work has been conceived. And I think his ideas, both in Working Space and in his recent work, is somewhat compromised by the fact that it actually confirms Greenberg's idea. That is, it's compromised by the fact that as an artist, Steller has been obliged to abandon painting for sculpture in order to affect the kind of space, the space that he yearns for out of Caravaggio and other Italian and Northern European Baroque and Mannerist paintings. He said to abandon painting for sculpture in order to affect the kind of space that he favors for his art, precisely the kind of space that Greenberg would characterize as an exercise in academicism. Why, I think it is natural to ask, of this theory of modernism, is it so important that painting confine itself so rigorously to what Greenberg conceives to be its own area of competence? In Greenberg's view, this is the only way left for painting to survive as a viable art, which is why the tradition of modernism is likely to be the only source of support, in his view, for the continued vitality of art. And this, I think, is one of the crucial passage in which his whole outlook on the history of culture and the place of painting in it in our time is set forth. We know, he writes, what has happened to an activity like religion that has not been able to avail itself of a Kantian mode of self-criticism in order to justify itself. At first glance, the arts might seem to have been in a situation like religion's. Having been denied by the Enlightenment all tasks they could take seriously, the arts looked as though they were going to be assimilated to entertainment, pure and simple. And entertainment looked as though it were going to be assimilated, like religion, to therapy. The arts could save themselves from this leveling down, Greenberg continues, only by demonstrating that the kind of experience they provide was valuable in its own right and not to be obtained from any other kind of activity. It is, I think you'll agree, a bleak view of art and a bleak view of our civilization, which Greenberg offers us in this account of modernism. And we naturally recoil from the impoverishments that it sets down, not as a cultural option, but as an historical fait accompli. We naturally prefer ampler and richer alternatives than those that are given us in the tradition of modernism as Greenberg defined it in this essay and in his other writings. But in our search for those alternatives and in our arguments about them, it behooves us, I think, to recall this critic's dour reminder about the danger the arts face in being assimilated to entertainment and of entertainment being assimilated to therapy. For, as we have ample reason to know, this is in large part what has happened to the arts in our time. Looking back on what has happened in the 30 years or so since Greenberg wrote modernist painting, and looking back on the changes that have overtaken, say, the art museums, other aspects of our culture, and the way the arts, say, are presented on television, and the way they're dealt with in criticism, or what we might call so-called criticism, that has come to deal with the arts, can we honestly say that we have escaped the fate that was forecast in Greenberg's essay? I don't think we really can. about this tradition of modernism, either as Greenberg has defined it or as we may wish to amend it, we may often feel inclined to say, as Marianne Moore famously said of poetry, I too dislike it. At the same time, however, we know that we have witnessed enough of what has come to be called postmodern culture to see what the alternative is. Precisely that avalanche of academicism, commercialism, and kitsch that is always ready to swamp our culture in the absence of a tradition vigorous enough to resist it. We have seen enough of what postmodernism has to offer us to have learned, perhaps, that it is only upon the foundations of modernism that the idea of tradition itself can now be salvaged, if it is to be salvaged at all. Whether, alas, we can muster the imagination, the moral energy to revitalize that resistant notion of tradition is, of course, a question that remains to be answered. Thank you.
I think, Hilton, the first question that occurs to me is a doubt as to whether you've been loading the dice. Since clearly, whether one agrees with Greenberg or not, he's a very much more considerable and formidable person than Cortissoz. And can I begin by asking you, is there a worthier or subtler or more nuanced or intellectually more formidable representative of tradition in the old sense, of roughly Cortissoz's era, that you could have chosen? Or clearly he represents a certain kind of conservatism of that epoch in chemical purity, but is there someone who perhaps doesn't quite fit that slot as well, but in some broader way does stand for tradition as Cortissoz would have understood it, who haven't chosen? Have you made it a little easier for yourself in choosing such a simple representative?
Well, it's true that Royal Cortissoz is right out of central casting. But the exponents of that position for the most part are. That is, I really don't know of, let's say, more intellectually cogent exponent of that position that would bring sort of heavier intellectual artillery to bear on those ideas. The people with, say, better minds than Cortissoz tended to shy away from dealing with the questions. They were sort of vaguely embarrassed by what we might call the intellectual vulgarity of Cortissoz, but they didn't like the alternative either, and so they mostly hid from the issues. And it was Cortissoz's views were pretty prevalent as sort of mainstream views in American cultural life until quite recent times. I mean, my late predecessor at the New York Times, John Cannaday, I think, while probably in many ways personally a more agreeable person than Cortissoz, must have been a terrible stuffed shirt, nonetheless basically held the same idea. Same ideas, and those were the ideas that prevailed in mainstream newspaper, magazine coverage of the arts until really probably
25 years ago.
Sure. But if Cortissoz is worth talking about at all, it's surely not only as a very central casting representative of that kind of pig-headedness, but also, it seems to me at any rate, as the, if you like, the last decadent, anachronistic, unthinking gasp of what had nevertheless been a conception of tradition, which had sustained Western art for several hundred years, yes?
Well, that, of course, is the question. I mean, was it that conception of tradition that had sustained Western art for those years? In the essay on the Armory Show, for example, Cortissoz has, many intelligent things to say about the paintings by Ingres and Delacroix that are in the exhibition. But when he comes to dealing with the work of living artists, the one that virtually the only one he can find to single out for lavish praise, he does have something rather intelligent but rather brief to say about Albert Pinkham Ryder. But the artist closest to his heart is, alas, J. Alden Weir, who is probably familiar to at least 6 people in this room. But he was a kind of an American sub-impressionist, and probably somebody with whom Royal Cortissoz lunched at the Century Club several times a week. No, I don't. I think that's really the mistake about this idea of tradition, that these were the ideas that had sustained Western art. They really weren't the ideas. I mean, it was really Cézanne who understood more about what had sustained Western art than Cortissoz. It was actually a very superficial idea of tradition, and the reason to disinter it, so to speak, is that I think by and large, it is still what we might call the uneducated conception of what a traditional view of art is. That is, a traditional view of art is that it's based on fidelity to nature and competence in draftsmanship. And by those standards, there are indeed, Cortissoz was correct about that, there are indeed many paintings by Cézanne which don't meet the standard. And, of course, in Kandinsky, it's hopeless.
Well, but isn't there a case, perhaps, for saying, you've put Cortissoz forward as your candidate, let's take him as the representative man, that it was and it wasn't the tradition, that if an old master could rise from the grave, he would recognize Greenberg or Cézanne as his opposite number in terms of the constant struggle, the constant battle for self-renewal, the constant rising above facility, which all great art must depend on. Of course, he'd recognize his kindred spirits there. But historically, there'd be a certain sense in which a narrower conception of fidelity and draftsmanship and so forth would be familiar to him in Cortissoz and not in Greenberg. What I'm really saying is, isn't there a perhaps necessary but tragic disjunction between modernist tradition and traditional tradition, which Cortissoz, attempting to interpret traditional tradition, is giving a weak parody, misunderstanding the strengths of that tradition, but nonetheless what Greenberg stands for represents, you said, narrowness, and one could think that Greenberg was right and think that Greenberg was inevitable and think that Cézanne was inevitable, but say that there is something tragic involved in the cultural break that is implied.
Oh, I'm
and therefore isn't Cortissoz rather a feeble and comic figure to take as an embodiment of a tragic breach in Western culture?
Well, I'm perfectly agreed that it was a tragic break, and of course that's why Cézanne is the key figure. I mean, that is Cortissoz and minds of his persuasion could embrace sort of virtually everything up to Monet, but Cézanne represented the turning point. And of course, it's with Cézanne, particularly to some degree, Manet and the Impressionists, but really Cézanne that modernist art in the sort of Greenbergian sense really commences. And yes, there is something tragic in the loss of any resource that art formerly commanded. I'm the last person to minimize the implications of that loss. I suppose what I was particularly concerned to do in bringing together such disparate figures was to try to establish what the debate about the viability of a continued life of art, what the debate about that continued viability was really about. I'm perhaps even more willing and eager than Greenberg to acknowledge the losses and to acknowledge the tragic implications of those losses. But of course, in dealing with art, it's what the reality is, not what we'd like to be the case, that I think criticism really addresses itself to. And I think that is the reality, that for the most part, the artists who have attempted to avail themselves of all these lost resources that, say, from Cézanne on, tended to be scuttled, have for the most part not succeeded.
Are you happy with, another question if I may, are you happy with tradition as the key term for describing the modernist tradition? Do you feel that it's not a sleight of hand to use it when it is a perfectly intelligible term for art until, I don't know, the mid-19th century or something? Is it this is information, I'm not a quarrel, but do you see it in the sense of a handing on, as opposed to a demarcation of what's possible? I know these are very similar concepts, but they're not quite the same.
Yes, I think there's really no other term to describe the kind of linkage that is traceable, say, from Courbet to Manet, from Manet to the Impressionists, from the Impressionists to Cézanne, Gauguin, Seurat, and Van Gogh, to Matisse, through Cubism, and on to through more recent developments in abstract art. I'd be perfectly happy to use a term other than tradition to describe that linkage, but I think it's not a twisting or a distortion of the concept of tradition to use it. I'm not. I wouldn't say that was the only use to which the concept of tradition could be put in tracing certain developments in 20th century art, but I do believe it's the principal one. And I don't know of any other way of describing it. I mean, it's the way the artists themselves think. I mean, there's that wonderful passage in Henry James's essay on the Théâtre Français, where he talks about the principles that no one has in his keeping, but everyone, meaning every artist, has in his memory and in his respect. And I think in that sense of a tradition, this modernist line, I think, has to be described as a tradition.
I've got some questions for the audience, but before, could I just ask you one factual question again? Is the phrase area of competence, which you used a number of times, a key phrase of Greenberg himself?
Yes, that is Greenberg's, that's part of this idea that he has put.
And although the idea is, to me, a commanding and more than acceptable one, isn't there at all to your mind something heart-sinking about the phrase, unless it's used ironically? Doesn't it suggest
Well, it's
academic
chilling.
but doesn't it suggest
Yes.
academic in the narrowest sense?
Yes,
Another kind of
it's
academic.
chilling. In the essay, in passages that I did not quote, he talks about the things, particular attributes that say painting shares with theater, that shares with sculpture, and he really narrows it down quite specifically. And it's not a sexy phrase.
No, but it's more than that. I mean, I buy the concept. Perhaps by God, I better.
Yeah.
But the actual,
the
and I
phrase is
can't think of a
chilling.
better phrasing myself.
phrase
and
is
yet,
chilling.
But it's just not chilling exactly.
Yeah.
That suggests that's too much credit for it. That's just something
only-
bleakly austere.
One thing to be said for it, I think, that it does tend to be the way certain painters think about their medium.
I'm being over-verbal. It's just that the phrase suggests to me the professor specializing in the late 18th century who
Yes.
won't offer an opinion on the early 18th century.
It does have that
Because-
liability.
Okay, let's broaden the scope with some questions from the audience. Let's take a general one first. Does any object which its creator calls a work of art, in quotes, qualify as such? If not, what objective criteria do you apply? In other words, how do you define art?
Oh dear. Well, I was once called upon to define art in a trial.
Which art?
An art dealer, alas, was indicted under the New York State statute. This goes back to the period of the Vietnam War. Was indicted under New York State statute that governs laws involving the desecration of the flag. And he had exhibited the work of an artist who used the American flag in various irreverent ways as a sort of anti-war protest. And as I had reviewed this exhibition in the New York Times, I was subpoenaed to appear as a witness at this trial. And I was asked and shown various photographs of these objects I'd reviewed. I was asked if I believed them to be works of art. And I said, yes, I did. I had said in my review that I believed them to be failed works of art. But nonetheless, as the judge reminded me, even a failed work of art qualified as a work of art. So what then, he asked, is a work of art? Now, I'm not sure that a court of law is the best venue for discussing such matters, but nonetheless, if you're sitting there and you're under oath, you have to say something. And what I believe I said was that any object or gesture that was created for the specific purpose to elicit an aesthetic response could be said to be a work of art. And it's a terribly inadequate definition, but it's still the best one I know. It has nothing to do with whether it's a good work of art, a great work of art, a failed work of art. But of course, one of the things the 20th century has taught us, if nothing else, is that it's relatively easy to produce something that passes as a work of art. That is something we can experience as art, even though it might be very slightly a work of art.
Let's make this kind of switchback ride and go on to a very concrete question. Are you familiar with the Twilight of Painting by R.H. Ives Gammell, I think the name is? And if so, what is your opinion of it?
Never heard of it.
And what is your opinion of it? Okay. Now, here are two questions from the same person, I think. Let me reverse the order, because the second, perhaps for obvious reasons, interests me a little more, though they're both interesting, I think. he says, why isn't Gombrich, E.H. Gombrich, a better representative of traditionalism than, well, presumably, than Cortissoz?
Well, Gombrich is, of course, infinitely more knowledgeable about the history of art than Cortissoz, or indeed of most persons living today. But he does not, for the most part, take an interest in making any judgments about them. That is, Gombrich has many interesting things to say about the way artists' minds have worked on the materials of their art. He has much to say in illuminating the iconography, the particular conventions in which artists work. But he really doesn't, as you might say, participate in the ongoing life of art. As far as I know, he has absolutely no interest in new art. If he has, he succeeded completely in concealing it. And in, if I may say, the best sense, he's an academic writer on art. That is, he really is a scholar illuminating, bringing to bear massive knowledge about objects that are very important to us. But I don't believe that any single thing that Gombrich has ever written has altered the standing of any work of art. That is, he's done a great deal to illuminate our understanding of what we know in art. But I don't think he has really expanded our understanding of the possibilities of art.
Can I just add a quick, because it's cheating, but can I add a quick supplementary of my own to that? You've been speaking, it seems to me, about the position of the artist and about the position of the critic. Gombrich embodies really the position of the teacher and the educator above all, and certainly tries to stand for a notion that there is a general corpus of knowledge, not only, of course, knowledge of the visual arts, which one hopes could be assumed and shared. Yeah. Do you think that too is, obviously you're in favor of everyone knowing as much as possible, but do you think that too as a cultural ideal is an antiquated one? And if it isn't, supplementary within supplementary, do you think that it's something which is perhaps accidentally damaged by the Greenberg position in the way people are actually taught art history and so forth?
Well, if I may begin at the end of the question, I think what sort of Greenberg's view of art history does is acknowledge something that's actually happened. I don't think it creates the situation. Of course, one would like to, one would prefer a cultural situation in which everyone was as knowledgeable as possible. Mm-hmm. What in fact is actually the case is that most old master painting that is seen in the museums by most people who look at them is looked at as virtually a form of modern art. Mm-hmm. That is, unless you have a fairly serious classical education, that you know the Greek and Latin classics quite intimately, that you know the Bible extensively, that you know certain other literary texts equally intimately. A great deal of the subject matter of old master painting is an absolutely closed book. So that most, say for posit the average person, say wandering through the Louvre or the Metropolitan Museum, sees these figures, say in Titian or Raphael or whomever, and well, they might know something about the Madonna. They might know something about the Christ child. They might even know something about Aeneas. But for the most part, the person going to the museum is not really experiencing that work in its full cultural dimensions. Is experiencing it as an expression of pictorial form. And I think that in many ways, to the extent that he's ever written about old master painting, I think, and he has from time to time, I think Greenberg, or a critic like Greenberg, is in some ways a more helpful guide to the contemporary response to old master painting. And indeed, as some of the passages in Frank Stella's book are, than, say, Gombrich, all of whose writings are implicitly assume a range of reference that really only people like Gombrich any longer have.
I'd quarrel with that because I think there are in-between stages there. It's not, but still, it's the audience's turn. Here's another specific one. Are classical references in neo-expressionist paintings, i.e. Palladino's use of Renaissance religious themes, a legitimate use of tradition or merely a reaction to modernism? Can an artist such as Kiefer be distinguished from an artist such as Schnabel in this respect?
Well, there are a lot of questions there. I'll focus particularly on perhaps one issue that this question raises, and that is that I suppose in contemporary art, that is the painting that emerged in the late 70s and has held the foreground of the art scene in the 80s, generally known as neo-expressionism, the principle operating, and I think it's probably the principle that has more than any other displaced the concept of tradition, is the principle of what's called appropriation. That is simply appropriating the imagery of the past, either as in a form of parody or some usage akin to parody. Now, I suppose one could say that appropriation has always occurred in the history of art, but as it's used in a great deal of neo-expressionist art, I would accept Kiefer from that. It does reduce itself to a kind of parody. That is, it invokes something largely for the purpose of measuring our distance from it. That is, if Schnabel creates a figure of San Sebastian in his paintings, we're not really expected to take the figure of San Sebastian seriously. We're expected to sort of be interested in Schnabel being interested in appropriating the image of Saint Sebastian, but there's nothing about religion, there's no sort of cultural resonance to it. Kiefer is a more interesting artist, I think, because unlike most artists who work in that mode, he has a real subject. That is, his subject matter is drawn from German history. He was born in 1945. He's dealing with both the immediate Nazi past and with the German past, more distant, that he sees as continuous with the Nazi period. And Kiefer is basically a kind of painter of dark historical romances, there's critical romances. I don't think he can be put in the same class with what we might call the appropriators.
now more general again. Can you relate the ideas about tradition expressed tonight by you to T.S. Eliot's view of it that you enunciated last year, namely that the newly created object alters the past and our perception of the past?
Well, yes, I was. It was actually rather. It required great restraint on my part, I think, not to have mentioned T.S. Eliot in tonight's lecture, since, of course, his essay on tradition and the individual talent is what you might call the traditional text for this talk. I think that the principal difference between, let's say, the Cortissoz or Philistine or, say, conventional view of tradition and the modernist or sort of Greenbergian view of tradition is that the latter really does conform to, and I think probably in Greenberg's case been profoundly influenced by Eliot's notion, because in Greenberg's view, modernist art has really given us a way of experiencing the art of the old masters in a way that would otherwise be closed, to extent that would otherwise be closed to us. And it really goes back to what I said earlier, that is, since we don't have the kind of access to the cultural world to that the old master produced their art from, that is, classical education and biblical upbringing and so on. I think we do tend to see, for example, Poussin much more in terms of Cézanne, and Cézanne much more in terms of Picasso, than we see Picasso in terms of Poussin. That is, I think our whole relationship to the art of the past has been profoundly shaped by our experience of contemporary art. And that, to that extent, I think Eliot's view of tradition has proved to be the functional view of tradition in our own experience of modern art, and as well as the art of the past.
Well, let's get specific again. Which, if any, of the East Village type artists will stand the test of time, in your estimation?
Well, I think we're still to see a few of them who will be in Andy Warhol's unforgettable phrase, famous for 15 minutes. But I don't I'll only speak for my own limited experience. One of the great luxuries of leaving the New York Times is that I don't have to go to the East Village if I don't want to. And I mostly do not want to. So I'm probably not the best guide to that particular morass. I'm perfectly content in my new life to wait until they come uptown. They'll still be quite bad enough then for us to judge them accordingly.
The mountain will come to Muhammad.
By the way, they're not cheap in the East Village either, so it's not a matter of saving money by getting in, on the ground floor, so to speak.
This one might perhaps be so general as to defy easy treatment, but can we be so sanguine about the modernist tradition when tragedy recurs in music, the novel, and architecture? Perhaps that's... I'll read that again.
Yes.
Slowly. Can we be so sanguine about the modernist tradition when tragedy recurs in music, the novel, and architecture?
Well, first of all, nobody's being sanguine about it. We're all being extremely troubled, I thought. As for tragedy in architecture, I agree that most contemporary architecture is a tragedy when it's not a comedy. However, I'm not sure that this way of thinking about painting is the most rewarding way of thinking about it. After all, I don't think we'll find much evidence of tragedy in Matisse, but he remains, for some of us, still the greatest painter of the 20th century. These tests are not necessarily to be applied to every artistic phenomenon that's available to us.
This is another question from a previous questioner. I don't quite follow it, but I think you'll get the general drift. It says, despite your criticism of Stella, insofar as you made some, is his art good, in your opinion? If it is he having a dialectic with the past, and is it valid? Why shouldn't it be valid?
Well, if the art were marvelous, of course, we would have more respect for the ideas, and which is to say, the ideas wouldn't matter. Now, in the first works that Stella produced in this three-dimensional vein, I wrote about them at the time, and I thought they were marvelous, and I still think those first works are marvelous. It never occurred to me when I saw them that he thought that he was doing something that Caravaggio had done. When it began to be clear that he had this obsession with Caravaggio and the kind of illusionist space that comes out of Mannerist painting, it seemed to me at first, well, I wasn't sure if it was a put-on or whether it was an attempt to, a rather grandiose attempt to legitimize something that he knew would be under attack from the sort of Greenbergian modernist tradition. But now that we have the Norton Lectures, which are tremendous, I mean, the Working Space, tremendously interesting book, because it's, for the most part, it's a much harsher attack on abstract painting, recent abstract painting, than anything Tom Wolfe would ever have been capable of. And what it finally leaves us with is a sense of one of the most successful living artists yearning to be able to produce a kind of art which he knows fundamentally is not accessible to the kind of artist he is. There's a great poignancy in this book, but I don't think that any serious critic would use the ideas in Working Space as a standard by which to judge what Stella does in his own work. But if you go lower down Lexington Avenue, across that new building across from the City Corps building, Mortimer Zuckerman's new building that has the biggest Frank Stella in captivity hanging in the lobby, I think you can see that, so far as this particular idea of moving from painting to sculpture has really collapsed. This is probably the most complete embodiment of the academicization of abstract art known to me on public view in New York.
This perhaps doesn't quite fit in what you said, but anything concerning you is part of tradition in some way, so I'll ask. Have you developed the ideas of Picasso's portrayal of women in a negative light anywhere else than in your New York Times review of the Picasso show?
Happily, no, I have not. And for those who did not read my article in the New York Times on the Great Picasso Retrospective, 1980, whenever it was, may I say that that was only a very minor part of the article. There is a whole industry now, of course, devoted to the feminist indictment of Picasso as being enemy of women and so on. I reject any association with that, and I think there are really more compelling issues in Picasso to be interested in.
Well, those are our questions of the audience. Can I ask you one more? And this is information, really, though it depends on a judgment of mine which you might not share. Speaking of someone who knows a bit more about literature, at any rate, I'm thinking of the idea of painting and flatness and the areas of competence and the inherent nature of the medium, what it can do autonomously, etc. It seems to me in literature it's true that all great writers have, in one way or another, been aware of the medium and what it can and can't do. And all fiction is to some extent about fiction, and Shakespeare's plays are to some extent about drama, whatever, at every stage. But in the last 20 or 30 years, the idea of that self-awareness of the medium, fictions about fictions, has become so widespread and so facile and so cute very often. It's produced a great deal of, to me, not very valuable fiction, shall we say. And is there, you may disagree, but assuming for the moment that you agree, that heightened self-consciousness, a kind of critical patter, which is caught up, so to speak, does tend to father these cute fictions about fictions about fictions. Is there any analogy in the development of painting in, shall we say, Greenberg's, to my limited understanding, totally valid stress on flatness and so forth? Has this become, as it were, a patter, and has it been parodied and used in a facile way, as any great innovation is liable to be, of course?
Well, I myself have never, be frank to say, been able to reconcile Greenberg's theory to the practice of literature. I feel somewhat taken off the hook, however, by the fact that the worst abuses of the analogy have been perpetrated at the hands of the postmodernist writers. That is, if you look at the modernist classics, I mean, Ulysses, or The Wasteland, or Sunday Morning, or Patterson, it's clear that there are, to a compelling degree, there is a self-consciousness of the both the resources and the limits of the medium in question that enter into the creation of the work in a very powerful way. But it isn't until what we might call the classical period of modernist literature has run its course that this ghastly academicization of that awareness, that sort of hyper-consciousness of the medium enters the literary world, and I think that is what what generally goes under the name of postmodernism. I mean, I was fascinated this past Sunday to read William Gass's review of Philip Roth's new novel, in which he welcomed Philip Roth to the ranks of the postmodernists. I hope that Philip Roth is sitting shiva over that review, but probably not, because after all, he wrote the book. But I think the analogy does break down in literature, because I think it's a much greater challenge in literature to define the limits of the medium.
Joyce had one sense of it, Eliot had another sense of it, Stevens, Pound, others had quite different senses of it. I mean, the cantos, in what sense do the cantos acknowledge the limits of the medium? I mean, the sky's the limit. I don't think that analogy really works, and which is one reason why I rather scrupulously avoided it in my lecture.
Right.
Thank you.
I think that's it. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.